Hello, I'm Debbie Martin, and together with Deborah Shaw, I'm presenting this talk on Chilean and transnational performances of disobedience, LasTesis, and the phenomenon of un violador en tu camino. And this talk is a shorter version of an article which we wrote last year, which is now out in the Bulletin of Latin American Research, and which is an open access article. Details on this slide. So on the 20th of November 2019, Chilean feminist theatre collective LasTesis staged a powerful street performance, Un violador en tu camino, calling out rape culture. The performance went on to be shared and restaged throughout Latin America and many parts of the world. And so I'm going to play a video, and this is not the original Valparaíso performance, but one that took place a few days later in Santiago.
El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer. Y nuestro castigo es la violencia que no ves. El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer. Y nuestro castigo es la violencia que ella unidad para mi asesino, la desaparición, es la violación, y la culpa no era mía ni dónde estaba ni cómo decía, y la culpa no era mía ni dónde estaba ni cómo decía, y la culpa no era mía ni dónde estaba ni cómo decía, y la culpa no era mía ni dónde estaba ni cómo decía, el violador eras tú. El violador eres tú. Son los pacos. Los jueces. El Estado. El presidente.
Okay, so I'll stop it there, although it continues a little bit more. So the original piece and Chilean restaging such as this one incorporates a powerful and catchy chant, as you've seen, as well as references to Chilean national songs and accusations of rape against the instruments of the state, including the president. The lyrics are matched with a dance routine that recalls the humiliating poses women are required to adopt when detained by Chilean state forces. In the original performance and many subsequent ones, performers wear blindfolds and tight, stereotypically feminine clothing for symbolic effect. The title is an ironic reworking of the Chilean police slogan, Un amigo en tu camino, while the chant incorporates a verse from the Carabineros, sorry, just one second, from the Carabineros Chilean police anthem, which is shown here. These early performances emerged alongside the massive protests that swept Chile in October 2019, and for which Human Rights Watch documented excessive force and injury perpetrated by the police, and in particular sexual violence perpetrated by the police towards women detainees. So in this paper, we will consider how the performance contributes to the relocation of art and feminist theory, moving them from academic and exclusive cultural settings such as theatres to the streets. We'll look at the performance's impressive transnational circulation and the cultural moment this responds to, looking at case studies of Chilean and Mexican restagings of the performance. We'll think about how Un Violador reverses the neo-colonial direction of travel of cultural movements such as MeToo, and we'll argue that Un Violador highlights a systemic state-sanctioned rape culture, and that it creates instances of collective embodied disobedience, inventing new subjects and intervening in the distribution of spaces and bodies. So I'm going to talk first, and then Deborah Shaw is going to speak after me on the relationship of Un Violador to MeToo, Ni Una Menos, and questions of collectivism, individualism and transnationalism. But first I'm going to talk about the performances, the relationship of the performance to theory, politics and aesthetics. So LasTesis, as their name suggests, intend to stage, and here I'm sort of glossing and paraphrasing, stage feminist theories in a simple and catchy way so that their message can reach those who haven't had the opportunity to read or study. And I'm paraphrasing the words of group member Daphne Valdez. For this performance, for Un Violador, the group drew on Argentine feminist anthropologist Rita Segato's analyses of rape culture. For Segato, the patriarchal myth of female disobedience and punishment is a pillar of rape culture. And this is an aspect of her analysis that LasTesis incorporate into their chant with the words, El patriarcado es un juez. Within patriarchy, all women or girls are at birth judged as disobedient and deserving of punishment. On the other hand, Segato argues that in order to counter this, what she calls a vital intensity of disobedience must be embraced and performed by women. And Un Violador responds to this call. The performance itself is in clear contravention of the rules of polite society, especially in as much as these rules are bound up with gender norms and expectations of women, our behaviour and movement in public spaces. The assembly of large groups of women, the parodic appropriation of the slogans and rhetoric of the state, and the use of forceful and loud chanting and in-your-face physical movements to call attention to what is censored and invisibilized in dominant culture, all constitute disobedient acts. And they form part of a new aesthetics of feminist rebellion in Chile, including the aesthetics of the Mayo Feminista protests of 2018, seen in this slide here. So coming back to El Violador, for Rita Segato, whose theories the group incorporate into the performance, the lack of importance given by the state to the crime of rape has to do with the fact that it is considered a crimen menor, a minor crime. It's associated with desire and the private realm. Crimes against men, on the other hand, Segato argues, are seen as crimes against lo público, given the equivalency between the masculine and the universal subject. By naming the state as perpetrator, the performance draws attention to the unacknowledged continuities between so-called private acts of violence and public institutions. When the song denounces the rapist as you, in past and present tenses, it refers not to individual victims or perpetrators, but rather presents a systemic abuse of women's bodies. In Un Violador, groups of women come together to perform in symbolic state and judiciary linked locations, situating the crime of rape as a major, a general and a public phenomenon, rather than a minor, particular and a private one, transforming rape into a crime against lo público. As Segato herself argues, feminism in the Southern Cone has been predominantly a feminismo letrado, and therefore a Eurocentric feminism. Like the Mayo Feminista protest that we saw in the previous slide, LasTesis' performance originates in the university. So the members of LasTesis are themselves researchers and lecturers in the Escuela de Teatro in the University of Valparaiso. But it also acts to counter the elite tendency of Southern Cone feminism, bringing it to audiences and participants who have historically been excluded from it. Street performances of Un Violador and the social digital media through which they travelled are both accessible to a wide range of women, either as participants or onlookers. Such performances become a site of the production of knowledge and the construction of theory. In them, the objects of study, the objects of feminist study, women, are repositioned as subjects and producers of embodied feminist knowledge. The performance can thus be understood as a means of decolonizing and de-hierarchizing this knowledge, and its staging in diverse locations, not only the capital cities that we're going to explore, Deborah is going to explore later on in the talk, but also, for example, by the indigenous women of the Escuela Antisuyu Huamicuna in Puyo, Ecuador, or at the secondary school Enedino Jimenez in Juchitán, Mexico, supports this. The performance then has crossed boundaries of age, education, class, ethnicity, and geography, producing learning through collective, horizontal, and non-hierarchical dynamics. Un violador can also be understood as a political act in the sense in which Rancière defines it. Its performances interfere in and reconfigure what's visible and audible, making public what's deemed to be private, combating erasure and silencing. For Rancière, politics can be defined as the activity which breaks with the order of the police by inventing new subjects. Politics invents new forms of collective enunciation. It reframes the given by inventing new ways of making sense of the sensible, new configurations between the visible and the invisible, and between the audible and the inaudible, new distributions of space and time. In short, new bodily capacities. Redistributions of space and its uses are part of the political power of un violador. High-profile, state-linked locations of the performances magnify the assertion of a right to appear made by these performances. The right of women to occupy the street, to walk the street dressed as they wish, without violation or assumptions made about them, is highly contested in contemporary culture. The public assembly of women in large groups, calling attention to themselves, both through visual spectacle as well as loud chanting, reconfigures the dynamics of gendered public space, changing its uses and meanings. Through its intense corporeality as well, Un violador strives to create the new bodily capacities of which Rancière writes, a new form of collective enunciation which breaks with the old regimes of the sensible, the sayable, and their distribution of bodies. A use of the body as a means of subversion and resistance, which follows from a history of such uses in the work of, for example, to give a famous Chilean example, Díamela el Tit, but also of recent artistic and performance-based protest culture in Chile, such as the Mayo Feminista protest that we saw before. In this performance, in Un violador, subjugation, pain, humiliation and resistance are embodied, and the performance acts as a means of creating embodied knowledge in those who view or participate. So it not only takes theory to the street, but it also takes it out of the written or verbal discursive realm, transforming it into a kind of embodied thinking and creating the space for transformation of individuals into collectives and potentially docile bodies into resistant ones. As Nellie Richard writes of the occupation of universities in Chile in 2018, Un violador is also performative in the sense that its participants begin to experience that for which they're fighting. These protests and performances enuncian el cambio. They both announce and enunciate change. All right, so now I'm going to pass over to Deborah Shaw, who's going to speak, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
So my section is entitled Un violador en tu camino, ni una menos, and MeToo, individualism, collectivism, and transnationalism. So in our work on Un violador en tu camino, we were interested in comparisons and contrasts with MeToo activism. We consider Un violador en tu camino as an example of transnational performance activism with its origins in Chile. Its global adaptation and reach allow us to read the performance as part of a decolonial project and highlights that the US should not be taken as the single origin point of women's activism. Rita Segato has noted the colonial power structures of social movements, including MeToo, comparing the Latin American Ni Una Menos movement against femicide to the US MeToo movement in the following terms. As far as Ni Una Menos is concerned, let's remember that there's a coloniality within social movements as well. That coloniality is deceptive and disorientating. MeToo, with its roots in North American Pilgrim Puritan feminism, is directed towards and appeals to the paternity of the state, while MeToo speaks to the state. Ni Una Menos speaks to all of us, men and women. It speaks to a society. This comparison can be extended to performances of Un violador, as while MeToo appeals to the state for justice, Un violador critiques the state as the site of patriarchal violence. And it's worth noting that members of LasTesis have also rejected working with government or declaring an affiliation with any political party, writing on their Instagram account, "La política institucional jamás será nuestro hogar." Nonetheless, few high-profile movements are constrained by national borders, reductive meanings, or singular affiliations to any one hashtag or performance of political resistance. And we document MeToo activists who have embraced un violador, such as performances outside the courtroom in New York at Harvey Weinstein's trial in January 2020, followed with performances on the same day on the subway and outside the Trump Hotel. Likewise, Latin American feminists have adopted and adapted the denunciatory power of MeToo, an example being the profession-specific MeToo Twitter accounts in Mexico. And we say more about this in the article. MeToo, hashtag Ni Una Menos, and Un Violador are among many nodes of new transnational feminist forms of activism in the digital age. Yet the global reach of Un Violador and its multilingual performances have disrupted MeToo's celebrity-led domination of anti-sexual violence narratives. The strength of Un Violador lies in performances by women of diverse backgrounds and nationalities. The performers give their own voice to words that they make their own. There's no fixed lineup, there's no dominant story of rape, there are no stars or soloists, and each performer has equal value and is part of a collective. The fact that the addressee of the song, the you, is both linked to the state, but also anonymous and potentially everywhere, denotes a systemic abuse of women's bodies by a patriarchal apparatus that's collective, transnational, and transhistorical. There are multiple bodies in the performance, and the fact that not all women have been raped and not all men are rapists is not the point. The insistent use of the second person singular, el violador eres tú, situates this performance in the accusatory mode. This is not victimhood, it's abuserhood, you. It's not me too, it's we too, and you too. In short, transnational collectivism characterizes performance of Un Violador and its attack on rape culture. The distinction with MeToo is a question of emphasis. While MeToo builds a collection of individual stories which shines a light on the scale of sexual violence against women, Un Violador and Ni Una Menos understand a priori that rape and femicide are rooted in misogynistic cultures rather than in individual men. Un Violador has gone global, with performances documented in 200 cities in 2019, and certainly more by the time that we're speaking, with the main concentration in Latin America, North America, and Europe, as you'll see from the map. Transnationalism works both with and against universalism, as each performance speaks to the pervasiveness of rape cultures, yet is adapted for each specific context. For instance, lyrics were adapted in performances in India to reference the lack of justice for women of lower castes, and performances in Turkey focused on femicide and police repression. And we write more about this in the article. For the purposes of this short presentation, we'll consider two performances in Latin America, one in Chile performed by LasTesis Senior and one in Mexico. So let's look at the Chilean LasTesis Senior performance first. LasTesis Senior were inspired by their younger compatriots to stage their own performance. This took place in December 2019 opposite the Estadio Nacional de Chile, a notorious centre of detention and torture for over 40,000 political detainees of Pinochet's regime. The performance was organised by 10 women's groups and attended by 10,000 women, approximately, clearly. LasTesis Senior wore black and red in homage to women who were raped or murdered during the dictatorship. Un Violador's references to impunity and disappearances acquire a new resonance when performed by LasTesis Senior, as many of their generation were victims or survivors of extensive and routine acts of rape, sexual violence and torture carried out during the dictatorship. As documented in the 2004 Valech Truth Commission reports. Mariana Giofili notes that the report concluded that sexual torture had been practiced in the whole country, in particular all police detention centres, which gives a historical context to the lyrics that accused the police of being rapists. One infamous site in Santiago de Chile was known as the Venda Sexy, sexy blindfold, or the discotheque, as the guards would blindfold the detainees and play loud music as they were raped and tortured. Blindfolds worn by LasTesis Senior then acquire historical meaning that is connected to their symbolic protest against the eye injuries inflicted on recent Chilean protesters. In this cross-generational alliance, older generations of Chilean women ensure that their historical experiences are remembered and their aggressors denounced. So we want now just to turn to Mexico briefly. Mexico has also been the site of multiple performances of Un Violador, and we want to draw attention to the performance in Mexico City that took place on the 29th of November 2019 in its famous Zócalo. It was the largest of many performances throughout the country and included women of all social classes, ages, sexual orientation and class and ethnic origin, with thousands in attendance filling the Zócalo. Many women, as you'll see from the images at this event, wore the green bandanas associated initially with Argentinian calls for abortion rights, which highlights the trans-regional spread of feminist activist concerns in Latin America. The Green Tide movement that spread to Mexico via digital media from Argentina demonstrated shared concerns for free and legal abortion for all women. Many of the women on the way to Un Violador performance were also pictured carrying placards with images of crosses marked with Ni Una Menos, hashtag Ni Una Menos, adopted to speak to the alarmingly high instances of femicide in Mexico. And this is from a previous demonstration, but you can see the images that, that were carried in the El Violador performances. Un Violador is then one in a series of feminist protest events staged in pre-COVID Mexico when large gatherings were allowed, decrying gender-based violence. As we've shown in this paper, in this presentation, the performance cannot be separated from a larger context of social unrest and protest, whether that be in Chile, Turkey, Poland, India, or Mexico, or wherever it's performed. So we just want to end this with a quick update. The performances of Un Violador brought global attention to LasTesis, which was welcome for feminists around the world, but clearly not welcome for the Carabineros, for the Chilean military police. They called for LasTesis to be brought to trial, accusing them through Un Violador of fomenting acts of violence committed by Chilean protesters. But in January 2021, Valparaiso's court rejected the Carabineros' lawsuit. A report in Telesur notes that highlighting the artistic nature of the group, Judge Ingrid Alveal explained that there was no proof to show a connection between their statements and actions and possible aggressions received by police officers during social protests in 2019. The case brought by the Carabineros only succeeded in bringing LasTesis increased support, including a petition addressed to Sebastián Piñera's administration, sent by A-list Hollywood actresses, demanding that the Carabineros charges be dropped. LasTesis have also been recognized in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People of 2020. Although it may be too soon to fully understand the significance and legacy of Un Violador en tu Camino, in this talk we've argued that LasTesis' performance has been significant in its translation of feminist theory for a non-academic setting and its shifting of the location of knowledge production, confronting and condemning rape culture through new forms of collective bodily enunciation. Its non-hierarchical, empowering format has created opportunities for self-transformation and solidarity amongst participants and audiences. The power of Un Violador is evidenced by the fact that it's taken on a transnational life of its own, with its message and impact gathering force. It's travelled far beyond what LasTesis had foreseen, making manifest the global pervasiveness of rape culture and women's resistance to it, and launching LasTesis themselves into radical transnational partnerships of feminist activist art creation. And they've collaborated with Pussy Riot, for example, following the success of this performance. Un Violador en tu Camino has given voice to a new recognition of the ways in which sexual violence against women is systemic and structural, and has enabled a new coming together of women who draw strength from each other across borders. So that's the conclusion of our talk, and we thank you very much for listening.